The courthouse in Willow Creek had never seemed so daunting to Carlton Bascom. He stood at the foot of the wide granite steps, inhaling a slow, steadying breath as the early spring sun warmed his face. Although the sprawling lawn around the building glistened with dewy grass, he couldn't help noticing how the structure's towering columns and dark wooden doors evoked an air of formidable power. Today, he would step into that power's domain, and attempt to bend it toward truth. At 30 years old, Carlton was tall and rangy, with steady hands from years of carpentry work, and an equally calm disposition forged in the crucible of a tumultuous upbringing. He had grown up in a cramped housing project on the outskirts of Atlanta, taking on odd jobs to help keep his struggling family afloat. Books had been his escape, a safe harbor of knowledge and possibility that not many people had expected him to explore. Through these dog-eared pages, he discovered a quiet fascination with the law and an uncanny knack for dissecting complexities that left others baffled. Had circumstances allowed, he might have followed that interest into formal study. But life had different plans, demanding that he work multiple jobs to support himself and his ailing mother. A year ago, the unexpected passing of his mother drove him to relocate to Willow Creek in search of a fresh start. The small town charmed him initially, its calm streets, lush parks, and close-knit community were a world away from the frantic hustle of urban sprawl. Yet that promise of a peaceful life evaporated when a petty dispute over a neighbor's fence line spiraled out of control. Carlton found himself accused of trespass and property damage, charges he vehemently denied. Unable to afford a lawyer, and with an inborn conviction that the truth was on his side, he'd made the audacious decision to represent himself in court. As he crossed the threshold into the courthouse foyer, the cool air struck him with a sobering jolt. A few faces turned toward him, some with curiosity, others with indifference, before returning to their silent vigil or hushed conversations. The hall smelled of old wax and faint cologne, accented by the occasional squeak of shoes on polished floors. Rows of stiff-backed benches lined the walls, providing uneasy seating for those awaiting their turn with the gavel. Carlton took a seat, cradling a battered leather briefcase filled with his carefully arranged papers, notes, and evidence. A wave of uncertainty rippled through him. He was no lawyer, after all. Yet he felt a spark of confidence flicker in his chest, bolstered by an unshakable sense that he was doing what he had to do. Soon, a bailiff in a crisp uniform emerged from a side corridor, calling out, "Bascom versus Thomason, please report to courtroom 3." Carlton exhaled the tension gathering at the base of his spine and rose to his feet. Clutching his briefcase and the faint but resolute hope that right would prevail, he headed down the corridor, each step echoing dully against the silent walls. Courtroom 3 was smaller and less grand than he had imagined, a high bench where the judge would preside, 2 tables facing the front, one for the prosecution, or plaintiff, in civil cases, one for the defense, and a modest gallery behind a wooden rail for onlookers. The overhead lights lent a harsh brightness that amplified every minor flaw in the paint and every anxious face in the benches. At the front, near the judge's bench, stood the man behind his legal woes, Richard Thomason, a scowling, heavy-set landowner who claimed Carlton had destroyed a portion of his property. Thomason wore a polished suit and held himself with a certain smugness that hinted at local influence. Carlton forced himself not to look away. A murmur washed over the tiny crowd of spectators when Carlton approached the defendant's table alone, wearing a modest shirt and slacks. There was a protocol he had studied: stand tall, wait for the judge to address the court, and only then begin speaking. So, he merely nodded courteously at the bailiff and arranged his notes on the table. The faint hush of rustling papers in the room felt portentous. Shortly thereafter, a door behind the bench opened and in strode Judge Sterling Whitcomb. He was a lean man in his mid-50s, sporting a steel-gray mustache and an air of bemused authority. With his black robe billowing slightly, he settled into the high-backed chair, glancing down at a set of files before him. Silence blanketed the courtroom. "This is the matter of Thomason versus Bascom," Judge Whitcomb began, his gaze skimming the documents until it reached the lines indicating that the defense would be self-represented. He arched an eyebrow. Mr. Bascom, the judge addressed Carlton, I understand you've chosen to proceed without counsel. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Carlton replied, voice steady despite his pounding heart. I intend to represent myself. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Thomason giving him a derisive half-smile. But even more jarring was the way Judge Whitcomb's lip curled in a fleeting hint of amusement. The judge tapped his pen thoughtfully on the desk, then gave a pointed look at Carlton's modest pile of documents. Very well, he said, a note of skepticism lacing his tone. We'll see if that was the wisest decision. The remark landed with a stifled chuckle from Thomason's side of the aisle. A flicker of resentment pricked at Carlton's nerves. He forced himself to keep calm, remembering the nights he'd spent in the library corner, devouring legal texts and dissecting case law. All that late-night research had to count for something. He wasn't about to let a patronizing remark derail him. Judge Whitcomb motioned for the bailiff to call the case, and soon, opening statements commenced. Thomason's attorney, an older man with a southern drawl and an air of breezy confidence, delivered a succinct, condescending summary of the irrefutable evidence. He painted Carlton as a brazen trespasser who had flouted property boundaries for months, culminating in vandalism that harmed Thomason's land. At one point, he glanced over at Carlton with a look that suggested pity, as though his presence in that courtroom was nothing but a naive attempt at playing lawyer. When it was Carlton's turn to speak, he stood, hands clasped loosely before him. Though every cell in his body screamed nerves, he forced his voice to remain firm. He introduced himself, clarified the real estate lines he believed had been misrepresented by Thomason, and asserted that the fence in question had been hastily erected on disputed property lines. He then voiced his suspicion that Thomason's entire claim was a ruse to intimidate neighbors and gradually expand his own land rights. A ripple of laughter skittered across the plaintiff's side, and even Judge Whitcomb allowed a subdued smirk to cross his lips. Mr. Bascom, these allegations, do you have any foundation for them? The judge asked, exuding skepticism once more. Carlton inhaled, recalling the nights of studies, the maps he'd scrutinized, the local zoning law references he'd cross-checked. Yes, Your Honor, he answered, lifting a small sheaf of papers. I have land surveys, witness statements, and official records that suggest Mr. Thomason's boundary lines have shifted multiple times over the past year. The judge's smirk did not vanish, but there was something in the air, some intangible note of tension, that told Carlton a seed of intrigue had been planted. He took his seat, ignoring the hush that spread through the gallery. Thomason's attorney rolled his eyes, but behind him, Thomason's confident grin seemed to falter slightly. Watching them, Carlton realized with a jolt of clarity, they expected him to crumble, to plead ignorance under the mildest legal scrutiny. They fully intended to bury him under a litany of facts he would be too inept to refute. What they didn't know was that beneath his calm exterior lay the fierce intellect of a man who had pored over every single scrap of property law he could get his hands on, determined to protect the only place he called home. As the session adjourned for lunch, Judge Whitcomb tapped his gavel lightly. We'll reconvene in an hour to begin examining evidence, he announced. Then his gaze flicked once more to Carlton, an unreadable expression dancing across his features. Mr. Bascom, I do hope you're ready for what's next. Carlton merely met the judge's stare with quiet resolve. Though the laughter and doubt swirling in that courtroom weighed on him, his own sense of purpose refused to buckle. He would not be another casualty of legal intimidation. Tucking his notes under his arm, he exited the courtroom into the bustling hallway. With each step, he reminded himself, he owed it to his mother's memory, to himself, and to every person who had ever been underestimated, to see this through. And so began the battle, a contest between prejudice and perseverance, cynicism and conscience, where only one side could emerge victorious. Carlton Bascom found a moment of quiet amidst the bustling courthouse hallway once the judge announced the midday recess. With an hour until the proceedings resumed, he maneuvered around tense clusters of lawyers and anxious plaintiffs, all engaged in hushed, urgent conversations. The thick walls echoed with muffled footsteps and the low hum of legal chatter. Carlton hugged his battered briefcase close, the day's tensions churning in his mind. A few sideways glances followed him as he made his way down a sunlit corridor. Some folks from the public gallery, curious about the man who dared take on Richard Thomason without an attorney, whispered behind their hands. Carlton caught flickers of speculation. Some recognized him as the soft-spoken newcomer who fixed fences and performed odd carpentry tasks around Willow Creek. Others openly doubted his capacity to stand against such a well-connected landowner in a legal battle. Yet, despite the weight of their silent judgments, he pressed on, making his way to a small courtyard nestled in the courthouse's annex. The courtyard offered a welcome reprieve from the stuffy interior. A few potted plants and a narrow patch of green provided a semblance of serenity. Carlton lowered himself onto a wooden bench, the warm rays of midday sun easing the tension in his back. He rummaged through his briefcase, carefully rechecking the notes and documents he had meticulously organized. He found the topographic maps showing property lines in detail. He had studied them countless times, yet the knowledge of how easily a judge's bias could overshadow the truth left him unsettled. His mind drifted momentarily to the preceding hour in courtroom 3. A swirl of emotions gripped him whenever he recalled Judge Whitcomb's mild smirk, that condescending line about the wisdom of self-representation. His gut twisted at the memory. Here was a man in a position of authority already poised to dismiss him. Could he penetrate that air of superiority? Pausing in his recollections, he inhaled deeply, reminding himself that everything hinged on the thoroughness of his evidence and his ability to present it with clarity and composure. "Carlton," a soft voice called out. He glanced up to see a woman in a simple navy blue dress approaching, a face he recognized from the short list of community volunteers he'd recently encountered. Her name was Justine Maxwell, a local who handled volunteer advocacy work for defendants with limited resources. She had been quietly watching that morning's session from a bench near the back. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. Carlton shook his head, offering a faint smile as he scooted to one side of the bench. "I saw you in the gallery," he said, voice hushed. "Didn't get a chance to say hello earlier." She nodded, clasping her hands in her lap. "I just wanted to check on you, see if you needed anything." A pause lingered, and then she spoke again, sympathy evident in her eyes. "It can be tough, being in there alone, especially when Judge Whitcomb is on the bench." Carlton stifled a cynical laugh, recalling the judge's dispassionate, near-mocking expression. "I guess you're aware of his reputation," he replied. Justine's shoulders dropped slightly. "I've sat through enough of his cases to know he doesn't hide how he feels about pro-se defendants, especially those who look like us," she said quietly, casting a cautious glance around the courtyard. "But that doesn't mean you can't win." Something in her words offered a minor lifeline. "I appreciate that," Carlton said. Despite the swirl of tension and the looming second half of the hearing, he felt a flicker of encouragement. Perhaps he truly wasn't as alone in this endeavor as it seemed. They spent a few minutes discussing aspects of the case. Justine asked if he had double-checked the county's older property surveys, the ones that sometimes contradicted the more recent lines. She also inquired if he had prepared a way to present them visually, to prevent the judge from brushing it off as pure conjecture. Carlton's responses became more animated as he detailed the hours he'd spent searching the local records office for legitimate boundary documents and cross-referencing them with modern surveys. He'd even found historical accounts describing how Willow Creek's property lines had shifted after a highway expansion decades ago, potentially relevant to proving that Thomason's claim of a long-standing fence boundary was questionable at best. Justine listened carefully, occasionally dropping a nod of approval. "You're more thorough than half the attorneys I've worked with. If you can keep your composure under cross-examination, you might surprise them all." The mention of cross-examination, though, released a wave of apprehension in him. He'd studied the basics of how to handle direct and cross, but reading about it and facing a seasoned litigator in real life were worlds apart. "I'm bracing for that," he admitted, forcing a tense smile. Thomason's attorney made it obvious he's not just trying to prove me wrong, he wants to humiliate me. Justine tilted her head in understanding. That's how they operate: intimidation, spectacle, ridiculing your knowledge. But remember, facts are facts. If your documents hold up, and you present them succinctly, no theatrics can wipe away the truth. At that, another voice called across the courtyard. Startled, Carlton recognized an acquaintance he'd seen rummaging through old county records on a prior occasion, Niles Carmichael, a retired surveyor who once handled land measurements around Willow Creek. Niles walked with a mild limp and wore thick spectacles, but his voice carried well. "Mr. Bascom. Heard you're the talk of the building this morning." Carlton beckoned him over, and soon Niles joined their informal group. Though nearly 70, the man's mind was sharp as a tack. He'd helped Carlson interpret a few of the older deed references, cautioning that land deeds here sometimes contained archaic wording. "I was in the corridor earlier, caught wind of your hearing," Niles explained, adjusting his glasses. "Figured I'd see if you needed another look at anything. I know how Judge Whitcomb can be." He let out a knowing sigh. "Doesn't always conceal his biases." Encouraged by the unexpected support, Carlton dug out a dog-eared map from his folder. Niles squinted as he examined the lines. With a weathered finger, the older man traced a boundary on the southwestern edge. "If memory serves me right, that portion was contested years ago. Some claim the developer never accurately pegged the corner post. You can see it here." He tapped at a point on the map. A jolt of excitement coursed through Carlton. This was exactly the sort of corroboration he needed. "Do you think you'd be willing to speak to that if I call you as a witness?" he asked quietly. "Even if only to clarify the old surveys?" Niles nodded, lips pursed. "If the judge allows it, sure. I'd love to see them forced to acknowledge these lines were never set in stone. Just promise not to call me last minute," he joked. "I might need an afternoon nap." A chuckle passed between them, lightening the tension overshadowing the day. By now, the hour was nearly up. Carlton glanced at his watch, noticing the minute hand closing in on the next scheduled session. Justine placed a supportive hand on his shoulder before they parted ways. "Don't let them see you sweat," she said. "You've done the work, trust in that. And if you need backup, we're here." Niles simply gave a firm handshake, his wrinkled smile warm with understated confidence. Alone once again, Carlton re-entered the courthouse, weaving through the returning crowd. The hallway leading back to courtroom 3 seemed narrower now, brimming with tension and bodies shuffling in from lunch. Emotions twisted in his gut: apprehension, yes, but a stronger sense of preparedness and a rising flicker of hope. The vow he'd made to defend the truth found renewed strength thanks to these unexpected allies. As he reached the courtroom doors, he paused for a beat. Inside, Judge Whitcomb would reconvene the hearing, presumably with the same air of mild contempt as that morning. Thomason's attorney would likely unleash a barrage of legal questions meant to corner him. But armed with meticulously analyzed documents, the knowledge gleaned from Niles's expertise, and Justine's quiet reassurance, Carlton felt more resolute than he had in weeks. He understood that the challenge ahead remained steep. Prejudice and skepticism were powerful adversaries. Yet he also believed that diligence, coupled with moral conviction, could shine a path through even the densest darkness. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the handle and pushed the door open. A hum of conversation, a few turned heads, nothing unusual. But in the hush that fell when the bailiff announced the hearing's resumption, Carlton Bascom walked toward the defendant's table as a man no longer entirely alone. He would stand tall against the tide, determined to reveal the truth, one carefully prepared piece of evidence at a time. And though he couldn't be sure of victory, he knew that every step forward was a step away from the life where he'd once believed his voice might never be heard. Carlton Bascom took his seat at the defendant's table again, noticing the subtle shift in atmosphere since the recess. The once casual curiosity among the onlookers had turned into something more charged, as though they sensed that the real heart of the dispute was about to be laid bare. Judge Whitcomb, poised behind the elevated bench, looked down over his half-rimmed glasses as if weighing how much time he wanted to waste on what he evidently considered a doomed defense. Still, he maintained a practiced neutrality, tapping his gavel lightly to call the court to order. Richard Thomason and his attorney, an impeccably groomed man named Warren Ellsworth, exchanged confident nods. Carleton braced himself, recalling how Ellsworth's practiced scorn had already made itself felt in earlier arguments. But he also recalled Justine's quiet encouragement and Niles Carmichael's offer of expertise, fortifying his resolve. If there was an undercurrent of doubt in him, it had no choice but to recede. This was the time to demonstrate both his command of the evidence and the rightful logic of his position. Judge Whitcomb began by inviting Ellsworth to present further testimony on behalf of Thomason, hinting that they'd continue with direct questioning before turning the floor over to Carleton. Ellsworth rose, a file in hand, and approached a small lectern to the judge's right. His voice was smooth and poised, a well-rehearsed, professional tone that aimed to exude absolute confidence in the plaintiff's claims. Your Honor, Ellsworth began, we would like to clarify the evidence introduced earlier this morning. Mr. Thomason contends, without any doubt, that the disputed land was always part of his property, marked by a long-standing fence line. The defendant, Mr. Bascom, crossed that boundary and, in effect, reconfigured certain boards to benefit his own yard. Our witness statements and photographic records confirm that Mr. Bascom took it upon himself to move fence posts. We also have neighbors ready to attest that he was seen tinkering with the boundaries at odd hours. As Ellsworth spoke, a projector screen lowered from the courtroom ceiling. A series of photographs appeared, grainy images that presumably showed portions of a fence near Carleton's modest home. Some pictures highlighted newly installed boards or unusual joinery that, according to Ellsworth's narrative, signaled Carleton's tampering. Carleton studied the snapshots carefully, resisting the urge to frown. He recognized the spots where he'd repaired the fence to keep stray animals from wandering onto his property, simple fixes, not an underhanded attempt to shift lines. Yet the photos were framed to suggest something more nefarious. Ellsworth called forward a neighbor, Mrs. Lenora Tuttle, to testify. She was a petite, elderly woman with kind eyes that seemed clouded by uncertainty. Under Ellsworth's direction, she stated she had once seen a figure outside near the fence around dusk. She said it might have been Carleton, though she admitted the lighting was poor. When pressed, she conceded that she didn't personally witness any fence line sabotage, only hammering or drilling noises that she found peculiar. Ellsworth thanked her graciously, resting his hand on her shoulder as he guided her from the stand, as though she'd delivered a mighty blow to the defense. Judge Whitcomb gave no overt reaction, merely nodding to acknowledge the testimony. To Carleton, it seemed a classic play, sowing suspicion through partial evidence, relying on uncertain witness recollections. He could feel a ripple of uneasy tension in the gallery. Ellsworth then requested a short break to set up final exhibits, but the judge refused, stating they'd proceed without delay. This left Ellsworth momentarily off balance, though he masked it well. The judge's gaze shifted to Carleton, who stood as quietly as before. Mr. Bascom, unless the plaintiff has more immediate witness testimony, the court invites you to begin presenting your defense. You indicated you'd like to cross-examine Mrs. Tuttle. Yes, Your Honor, I would, Carleton responded. Even as his pulse throbbed in his ears, he advanced to a small podium positioned a few feet away from the bench. Nerves pressed against his composure, but he forced them to recede, remembering the script he'd pieced together from reading cross-examination tips in library books. He had to be calm, respectful, and surgically precise with his questions. Resummoned to the stand, Mrs. Tuttle appeared more apprehensive this time, glancing from Carleton to Ellsworth. Carleton introduced himself politely. Mrs. Tuttle, you mentioned seeing a figure near the fence on a particular evening. Could you clarify how well lit the area was? The older woman blinked. Well, not very well. It was near sundown, and my kitchen light was on, but that was about it. Carleton nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact. So, you wouldn't say you got a clear look at the person's face? No, I wouldn't say that, she admitted. Her voice quivered as if she regretted being put in the middle of a legal fight. Carlton continued gently. You also said you heard hammering or drilling. Could that have simply been someone repairing the fence? Have you known me to do handyman work around the neighborhood? Mrs. Tuttle paused, wrinkling her brow as though recalling. Well, I've seen you fix that wobbly fence gate a couple of times. You're always out there with your toolbox. And if I recall correctly, Carlton added, you once asked me to help reattach a gutter that was slipping off your roof, which I did without charge. Is that true? She managed a small smile. Yes, that's true. She cast Ellsworth a fleeting look of uncertainty. A subtle wave of hush floated through the gallery. Even Judge Whitcomb's posture stiffened slightly, as though he was forced to consider that maybe there wasn't the malice behind these nighttime activities the plaintiff implied. With no further questions, Carlton thanked Mrs. Tuttle, and she stepped away from the stand, looking a bit relieved at her brief testimony. Ellsworth attempted a mild objection, claiming irrelevant lines of questioning, but the judge overruled him, remarking that context about fence repair or modifications was central to the dispute. Encouraged by this small victory, Carlton placed a large rolled-up paper on a stand near the bench. Unfurling it revealed a meticulously labeled map, one he'd spent hours creating. Detailed color-coded lines distinguished where the official county records set the property line, and where Thomason's claims deviated. As he positioned it for all to see, murmurs rose from the spectators. No one expected such professional clarity from a defendant without formal legal training. Your Honor, Carlton began, addressing Judge Whitcomb directly, this is a composite map using data from our county's public records, cross-referenced with topographical points. If you look at the southwestern corner, you'll see the historical boundary from 1975 differs from the boundary currently claimed by Mr. Thomason. My improvements on the fence line align exactly with the older, legally recognized boundary. Judge Whitcomb stood, stepping down from the bench to inspect the map more closely. A hush fell over the room as he leaned in, his expression tight with scrutiny. Carlton observed a flicker of surprise cross the judge's eyes. Meanwhile, Ellsworth shot to his feet, striding over with an obviously forced calm. He demanded to see the original references that led to the lines drawn on the map. But the more Ellsworth pressed, the more it became clear that Carlton had done his homework. He produced photocopies of county plats, date-stamped, as well as receipts verifying his rightful property improvements in the contested zone. While this was happening, local journalist Justine Maxwell, Carlton's new acquaintance, slipped in, quietly taking notes from a seat near the back. She watched with keen interest, sensing something bigger forming in the confrontation between evidence-based defense and the outwardly confident plaintiff. Half an hour into Carlton's presentation, the courtroom could practically feel the tide shifting. A second witness, Mr. Niles Carmichael, emerged from the gallery, an older gentleman with a slight limp. He was sworn in, introduced as a retired surveyor who'd once mapped various subdivisions around Willow Creek. Under Carlton's direct questioning, Carmichael explained how official lines had shifted slightly after a new highway bypass was constructed a decade ago. His recollection supported the older boundary that matched Carlton's carefully documented claim, not Thomason's more recent expansions. Carlton paused to let the import of that sink in. Thomas's attorney tried objecting on grounds that Carmichael had no updated license, but Judge Whitcomb waved the protest aside, remarking that the court would weigh the witness's knowledge of historical maps, not necessarily modern surveying methods. The calm, methodical nature of Carmichael's testimony lent credibility to Carlton's stance, especially when Carmichael cited a prior case from 8 years ago in which a developer used similarly ambiguous records to encroach on neighboring lots. Ellsworth's brow glistened with sweat. The once assured posture in his shoulders sagged as he repeatedly glanced at Thomason, whose face had turned a deep shade of red. The crowd murmured, enthralled by the unexpected competence of a man the judge had all but dismissed that morning. Even a few skeptical onlookers leaned in, whispering their surprise that this amateur might actually be on the verge of unraveling a property dispute many assumed was cut and dry. Before concluding, Carlton politely asked the court if he could submit further photographic evidence, pictures of the fence repairs he'd performed, complete with date-stamped metadata from his cell phone. It indicated precisely when he'd replaced rotted posts and hammered in new boards, crucially, well within the older boundary lines. The judge nodded, flipping through the images with an unreadable mask. For the first time since the hearing's start, Whitcomb didn't interject any snide remarks. If anything, he appeared to be taking the evidence seriously. When Carlton finally finished laying out his exhibits, the entire room felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for the judge's reaction. A hush lingered, heavier than the midday heat. Ellsworth, regaining composure, muttered about spurious documents and barely relevant hearsay, but little of his outraged commentary seemed to hold weight given the thoroughness of Carlton's references. "This is quite the compilation," Judge Whitcomb eventually said, clearing his throat. He avoided eye contact with Ellsworth, instead focusing on the map pinned to the easel. "I see you've gone to considerable lengths, Mr. Bascom, to support your claim. It's unusual to see such diligence from someone lacking formal legal training." Carlton simply offered a respectful nod, cautious not to appear smug. He recognized this as a pivotal moment, a tacit acknowledgement that the judge's earlier dismissal might have been premature. Ellsworth sought to salvage the moment, requesting a short recess to gather thoughts and question the validity of these older records. Yet from the gallery's perspective, the damage was done. Carlton had established a strong, coherent narrative that contradicted the plaintiff's simplistic version of events. All around, spectators exchanged whispers, the sense of tension replaced with an undercurrent of admiration for the unassuming defendant who quietly took the spotlight. As the judge motioned for a brief recess, the bailiff called for order, and people rose from their seats. Carlton exhaled slowly, releasing the tension coiled in his chest. He felt a trembling in his limbs, a byproduct of adrenaline from matching wits with seasoned professionals in a room where the odds had always skewed against him. But beneath that trembling lay a triumph as real as the sun shining through the tall windows. For the first time that day, he fully believed that not only was his cause just, but it might actually prevail, despite every attempt by Thomason and Ellsworth to belittle and sideline him. As the judge swept back toward his chambers, he seemed to pause fractionally by Carlton, as though to speak. Instead, Whitcomb pressed his lips together and continued, robe swishing behind him. The moment was brief, but it gave Carlton the faintest glimmer of satisfaction. He could sense that the judge, too, now wrestled with the possibility that this quiet, steadfast defendant had brought to the courtroom something far more potent than idle bravado, genuine, substantiated truth. Carlton stepped out into the courthouse corridor feeling both lighter and more on edge. The intensity of the last session had left his thoughts whirling, but a spark of confidence warmed him from within. The 10-minute recess, however brief, offered a space to regroup. While a few spectators hurried to the lobby or vending machines, Carlton lingered near a tall, arched window overlooking the lawn. Sunlight streamed through the glass, painting wavering reflections on the polished floor. He closed his eyes momentarily, slowing his breath. His introspection was abruptly interrupted when a voice called his name. Opening his eyes, he found himself face to face with Richard Thomason, who had approached with an unexpected air of calm. Thomason's attorney, Ellsworth, stood a few steps behind, scanning the hallway with a guarded expression. Thomason was still dressed in the same tailored suit as before, but the smug confidence seemed tempered now. "Mr. Bascom," Thomason said, nodding once. He spoke in a low voice, polite but stony. "I wanted to commend you on your thoroughness in the hearing. Didn't expect to see someone so well prepared." Carlton noted the phrase, "didn't expect," and allowed a faint, polite smile. "I appreciate that," he replied, matching the measured tone. "I've had to learn a lot in a short time." Behind them, a cluster of onlookers craned their necks, perhaps sensing a potential confrontation. Thomason caught the attention and shifted slightly, lowering his voice further. "This doesn't have to get messy," he began. "We can talk." I might be willing to work out an agreement, provided you're willing to meet me halfway. For a heartbeat, Carlton found himself disoriented by the sudden olive branch. The man who had threatened him with court action was now hinting at a compromise. Perhaps this was a sign that Thomason had grasped the strength of Carlton's case. But caution took hold. People like Thomason rarely gave ground without expecting something in return. "That's kind of you," Carlton said slowly, eyes flicking to Ellsworth, who listened with folded arms. "But I'd prefer any negotiation to be on the record, with the judge's oversight, just to avoid confusion." Thomason's thin smile tightened, and Ellsworth cleared his throat. "Carlton, let's be frank, we have the resources to drag this out if we need to. You may have made an impact, but it's hardly guaranteed the judge will rule in your favor. Why risk more court fees and a protracted fight? A settlement might be in both parties' best interest." The mention of court fees twisted Carlton's gut. He had little in the way of funds to endure a drawn-out legal battle. Yet he also recalled the hours of research, the witness testimonies, the evidence that strongly suggested he was in the right. Even if the official ruling was uncertain, the moral clarity he felt was unwavering. He measured his response carefully. "I'm open to settlement talks if they're fair. But I'm not about to give up valid property rights in exchange for avoiding hassle." Thomason's eyes hardened. "Define fair." Carlton hesitated. His sense was that if Thomason was now fishing for an off-record compromise, it likely meant the man recognized the risk of losing. Still, the last thing Carlton wanted was to be trapped by a private conversation that twisted his words. "I think that's a discussion best held in front of the judge. Or at least with some legal oversight," he said. Then, with quiet but firm resolve, he added, "I'm not trying to escalate this, Mr. Thomason, but I'm not walking away from what's right." For a moment, they locked gazes, a silent clash of wills. Then Ellsworth chimed in, "We'll see how the hearing continues. But be mindful, court battles can be unpredictable." Without waiting for a response, the attorney ushered Thomason away, presumably to reevaluate strategy. Carlton breathed out slowly, aware that passers-by had paused to watch the exchange. It dawned on him that each victory, no matter how small, pushed him closer to an actual shot at winning. But it also invited new forms of pressure. Perhaps intimidation had begun giving way to half-concealed attempts at co-opting him. As the bailiff announced the end of recess, the crowd drifted back into the courtroom. Carlton took a last glance at the bright midday sun before following suit, determination flaring anew. When Judge Whitcomb returned to the bench, the tension in the room felt heavier than earlier. A sense of finality shimmered in the air. The proceedings were rapidly approaching the pivot point where each side would lay out concluding arguments or bring forth final evidence. Carlton could feel the judge's gaze land on him briefly before scanning the rest of the room. "We'll resume the matter of Thomason versus Bascom," Whitcomb announced, rapping his gavel. "Mr. Ellsworth, any new evidence or witnesses for the plaintiff?" Ellsworth rose, clearing his throat with a show of composure. "Your Honor, we have one more witness, Mr. Hewitt, who claims to have observed Mr. Bascom altering fence posts on a separate occasion. We request the court to hear his statement." The judge nodded curtly, and a tall, wiry man in a plaid shirt took the stand. Under Ellsworth's direction, Hewitt recounted how he'd driven by the property one early morning and saw someone who looked like Carlton near the fence, apparently removing a wooden plank. He spoke uncertainly, stumbling over details like exact time, date, or vantage point. Carlton, keenly focused, noted the vagueness. When it came his turn to cross-examine, he calmly asked Hewitt whether the figure he saw was definitely him. Hewitt hedged, admitting he was fairly sure, but it was dark, and he didn't stop the car to investigate. Pressing further, Carlton pointed out that if the fence plank was rotted or broken, it wouldn't constitute malicious property damage, merely a repair. Hewitt mumbled something about not wanting to get involved. The net effect? The testimony felt weak, reliant on guesswork. Whitcomb's impassive face gave little away, but a quiet hush among the observers suggested they recognized how unconvincing it was. Ellsworth, looking a tad flustered, tried to salvage the impact by emphasizing the pattern of late-night tinkering. But the judge cut him off, remarking that the witness seemed uncertain. "I'll note the testimony, Counselor," Whitcomb remarked briskly, "but let's move on." "Very well," Ellsworth said through a tight smile. "In that case, we rest, Your Honor." A wave of anticipation swelled. All eyes turned to Carlton for what would presumably be his final statement. He stood, clearing his throat. Heart pounding, he grasped the edges of the lectern. This moment, he realized, was the crux, his chance to synthesize everything he presented into a coherent argument that might sway the bench. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady. "Over the course of this hearing, I've introduced documentation, maps, official county records, older land surveys, witness statements, all of which confirm that the property line Mr. Thomason claims is not reflective of the original boundaries. The fence I repaired, yes, I repaired it, remained within the established lines. In no way did I intrude on or destroy any rightful portion of Mr. Thomason's property." He paused, glancing at Thomason, then addressing the judge again. "We've also seen how the plaintiff's witnesses can't definitively place me tampering with the fence. Their recollections are vague, times uncertain, and no direct evidence of wrongdoing exists. In stark contrast, my exhibits lay out a clear chain of ownership, referencing official county records that have never been disputed until now." Ellsworth tried interjecting, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand, giving Carlton the floor. "I understand the skepticism regarding pro se defenses," Carlton continued more softly, mindful of the judge's earlier doubt. "But I ask the court to consider that my defense is based not on guesswork or hearsay, but on factual documentation. I am simply trying to preserve my rightful property boundary and to ensure I'm not forcibly dispossessed by inaccurate claims." A hush fell over the courtroom. A fleeting flicker of interest crossed Judge Whitcomb's face, as though he recognized in Carlton's words a sincerity that cut through the usual rhetorical posturing. Carlton inhaled gently, letting that silence underscore his statements. Ellsworth, reclaiming his role, gave a final rebuttal, an impassioned speech about how common sense favored the plaintiff and how no amateur with Google searches could stand against the established local landowners' documented usage of that space. He glibly dismissed Carlton's evidence as cobbled from unverified sources, ignoring the official stamps on the records. Some members of the gallery frowned, they had seen for themselves the detail in Carlton's exhibits. When Ellsworth finished, Judge Whitcomb pursed his lips. He drummed his fingers on the bench, eyes passing from Ellsworth to Thomason, then settling on Carlton. "We've heard extensive arguments and reviewed multiple exhibits. I'll take this matter under advisement and deliver my ruling shortly. Court is recessed for now." With that, the gavel struck. People stirred, rising from seats with a mixture of relief and pent-up tension. Thomason and Ellsworth shot a final glare toward Carlton before exiting through a side door. A flurry of conversation erupted among the onlookers, opinions swirling about which way the judge might lean. Carlton felt his knees slacken. The storm of evidence and cross-examination was over. Now, everything hung on how Judge Whitcomb interpreted the facts, and, perhaps, whether any hidden biases colored his judgment. He stooped to gather his folders, heart hammering in his chest. The adrenaline that had carried him through the hearing was ebbing, leaving his hands trembling slightly. Before he could exit, a soft voice called from behind, "Carlton, wait up." He turned to see Justine Maxwell weaving through the dispersing crowd. She reached him with a warm smile. "You did it," she said, almost breathless. "You truly held your own." "Felt like I was crossing a minefield," Carlton admitted, exhaling a laugh that carried equal parts relief and lingering anxiety. He gazed at the closed door behind which Judge Whitcomb had retired. "I just hope the judge bases his decision on the facts, not on appearances or personal biases." Justine nodded sympathetically, pointing out that she'd overheard some spectators praising how methodical and logical his approach was. If even casual onlookers recognized the strength of his case, there was reason to hope. She placed a light hand on his shoulder. "You've shown more clarity and preparation than many practicing attorneys," she offered. "Whatever comes next, you've done everything in your power." Swallowing the tightness in his throat, Carlton murmured a thank you. Despite the swirl of voices, footsteps, and the faint echo of other cases in adjacent chambers, for a moment, it felt as if Justine's reassurance anchored him. He forced a resolute nod, stepping out into the hallway with her by his side. "I guess now I wait," he said, a wry note coloring his words. "All this work, and it boils down to the judge's final say." She understood that sentiment all too well, how justice can hinge precariously on one individual's interpretation. "But remember," she gently reminded him, "if you lose, there could be appeals, or further steps. And if you win, it's a beacon for anyone else who's told they can't stand up for themselves." Those words clung to him. He had assumed from the start that losing might mean an inevitable eviction or worse, but perhaps it wouldn't be the end. And, inversely, winning might inspire others lacking the means for formal legal counsel to fight back when they were in the right. With each step away from the courtroom, the swirling mass of attorneys and civilians parted, revealing sunlight streaming through the main courthouse doors. At length, he pressed a quick handshake with Justine, promising to let her know once the ruling came. As she disappeared into the throng, he stood briefly under the arching entrance, inhaling the heady scent of fresh air. He looked out over the courthouse lawn again, the green grass glowing under midday sun. On the surface, it appeared a tranquil scene, yet behind those dignified walls, a single judge would soon decide the outcome of months of sweat and tears. Carlton allowed himself no illusions. That old legal aphorism, "possession is 9/10 of the law," often worked in favor of well-established property owners. But the thoroughness of his evidence, the unwavering sense of moral and factual correctness, these were the pillars upon which he placed his final trust. And if the system would listen to reason, he believed he might just walk away with not only the rightful boundary recognized, but a vital personal victory over the cynicism that had long overshadowed men like him. Clutching his ragged briefcase tightly, he took his first steps away from the building, uncertain yet hopeful about what tomorrow might bring, and more determined than ever that no matter the outcome, he had done all he could to stand up for himself and his life's dignity. Carlton Bascom's pulse fluttered each time his phone buzzed over the next few days. He spent evenings trying, and mostly failing, to distract himself with small carpentry tasks, repairing a neighbor's broken chair or sandpapering a bookcase. The quiet hours he once cherished now felt oppressive, every tick of the clock reminding him that Judge Whitcomb's ruling could drop at any moment. He oscillated between calm faith in his evidence and a gnawing fear that the court might somehow favor Richard Thomason's wealth and influence. A handful of supportive texts arrived from the acquaintances he'd made. Justine Maxwell continued to check in, sending him small snippets of reassurance. "Trust your presentation. You did more than enough," or "heard folks talking about how thorough your case was. Hang in there." Even Niles Carmichael called once, letting him know he remained on standby if any further clarifications were needed. Still, the tension that simmered beneath Carlton's carefully maintained composure only grew more potent. On the third day, a letter from the courthouse arrived in his cramped apartment's mailbox. The envelope bore the official seal, and Carlton stood frozen on the threshold, the paper trembling in his hands. Before he could tear it open, he fought down a sudden wave of panic. He forced himself to take a breath, recalling how many weeks he'd poured into the case and how strong his evidence was. Slowly, deliberately, he opened the envelope. The message was a curt notice that Judge Whitcomb would be announcing his ruling in open court the following morning at 10. No written verdict, no hints. Just a summons to appear. The adrenaline surge left Carlton's legs trembling. So it wasn't an immediate victory or defeat, he would learn the outcome in person, under the watchful eyes of the court. That night, sleep proved elusive. Vivid dreams churned through his mind, glimpses of the judge banging the gavel while lines on a property map shifted beneath a menacing shadow. In the dream, no matter how many times Carlton tried to align the boundaries, the fence posts kept disappearing, sinking into the ground. He woke up more than once, drenched in sweat, heart pounding as though he'd sprinted a marathon. Yet dawn broke gently, washing his small bedroom in pale light. After a quick shower, he dressed in his single best shirt and slacks, freshly ironed, then checked his battered briefcase. He retrieved the same folders he'd used before, though he realized with a wry grimace that the decision would likely hinge on the judge's reflections rather than any new argument. Still, having them at hand felt like a shield, a tangible reminder of the work he'd done. He arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. Soft beams of sun glimmered off the stone pillars, and a handful of attorneys and clerks paced across the lawn. Inside, the building buzzed with daily routine, a bailiff asking for ID here, a clerk handing out schedules there. But at courtroom 3, the tension hung thicker. Carlton found a seat near the front, setting his briefcase on the floor by his feet. Richard Thomason and Warren Ellsworth strolled in next, passing him with little acknowledgement. Thomason's jawline was tight, and Ellsworth refused eye contact. Perhaps they shared the same edge of unease, uncertain if their usual legal intimidation had sufficed. A smattering of onlookers filled the benches, some older residents from Willow Creek, a couple of local bloggers curious to see how the case concluded, and a few men in suits who whispered among themselves, likely associates of Thomason. On the aisle, Justine offered Carlton a discreet nod, her eyes glinting with encouragement. 10 o'clock arrived. The bailiff rapped on the door, instructing everyone to rise. Judge Whitcomb swept in, robes billowing behind him. His expression was unreadable, a neutral mask, betraying no glimpse of the decision he carried. Settling behind the bench, he cleared his throat. "This court reconvenes in the matter of Thomason versus Bascom," he announced. "I've considered the arguments and evidence presented. Today, we shall issue the ruling." His gaze flicked across the rows. "Is the plaintiff, Mr. Thomason, present?" Ellsworth rose briefly. "We're here, Your Honor." "And the defendant, Mr. Bascom?" Carlton stood, voice faintly tight. "Present, Your Honor." Judge Whitcomb shifted in his seat. An almost tangible hush descended on the room, folks leaning forward to catch every syllable. This dispute revolves around a contested boundary line, the older county records, and whether or not Mr. Bascom trespassed. The evidence introduced by the defendant included historical land surveys and witness testimony suggesting the fence line in question did indeed deviate from official records, in contradiction to Mr. Thomason's claims. His measured tone echoed in the silent chamber. Carlton felt his heartbeat in his ears, the hush of the gallery amplifying each carefully chosen word the judge spoke. In reviewing these documents, Whitcomb continued, "The court notes that Mr. Bascom's exhibits, particularly the composite map cross-referencing county plats, demonstrate a credible claim that the recognized boundary had changed over time. Furthermore, witness testimonies, including that of Mr. Niles Carmichael, lend credence to the possibility of an older, rightful line that conflicts with Mr. Thomason's stated boundary." Carlton's throat constricted with cautious relief. So far, the judge was acknowledging his side's points, describing them as credible. Yet, he recalled how quickly legal decisions could pivot. Judge Whitcomb's neutral expression didn't falter. Thomason and Ellsworth sat rigid, jaws clenched. Additionally, the judge went on, "The plaintiff's photographic evidence and witness accounts do not conclusively prove that Mr. Bascom engaged in deliberate trespass or malicious modification of the fence. The mention of late-night tinkering, while suspicious, lacks sufficient specificity to outweigh the defendant's documented repairs and property improvements." A faint ripple of movement crossed Ellsworth, as though he might object. But he remained silent under the judge's pointed glance. In light of this, Whitcomb stated, adjusting papers on his desk, "The court finds that the property lines supported by Mr. Bascom's documentation more accurately reflect the pre-existing boundary. Therefore, the eviction request, and the underlying claim of unlawful trespass, cannot stand under these circumstances. The fence repair in question appears consistent with an attempt to maintain existing structures, not to encroach on Mr. Thomason's land. As such, the court dismisses the complaint. A hush, then a collective intake of breath from the gallery. It was done. Carlton felt a wave of relief wash over him, limbs suddenly weak. He almost had to grip the bench to steady himself. Judge Whitcomb wasn't finished, though. He lifted a single page of typed text. That said, he continued evenly, the matter of how these boundary lines were presented to Mr. Bascom remains of concern. If, at any point, Mr. Thomason was misinformed about property expansions or if records were misfiled, it's an issue for further administrative review. But for now, the immediate case is concluded. The eviction complaint is dismissed, and no further action shall be taken against Mr. Bascom for alleged trespassing. Court is adjourned. He struck the gavel. The tension that had latched onto the room seemed to break in a sharp exhale. Some watchers let out soft gasps, others whispered in surprise. Thomason's face was a thundercloud. Ellsworth scowled, though he tried to mask it behind a professional facade. A swirl of relief, triumph, and exhaustion coursed through Carlton. His shoulders sagged momentarily before he remembered to stand tall, refusing to let the wave of emotion show too overtly. He packed his materials quietly, ignoring the pinched expression of Thomason as the man stalked out with Ellsworth on his heels. Justine caught up with Carlton as he made for the door, offering a wide grin. "You did it," she whispered excitedly. "Congrats, counselor." Her jest carried genuine warmth. Out in the hallway, a few onlookers approached, mostly strangers, murmuring that they'd admired his diligence or that they were glad to see the underdog prevail. Carlton answered with polite nods, a swirl of gratitude and unreality making it hard to find the right words. The moment felt surreal, as if the building itself had allowed a small, improbable victory to slip through its austere halls. At last, stepping onto the courthouse steps, he inhaled fresh air. The bright midday sun felt celebratory, gilding the walkway and letting him see Willow Creek's quiet streets in a new, hopeful light. The weight of uncertainty that had hung on him for so long lifted, replaced by a blossoming sense of relief so strong it nearly stole his breath. He turned to find Niles Carmichael hobbling toward him, cane tapping on the pavement. "Knew you had the facts on your side," the older man said, voice gruff with quiet pride. "They couldn't overshadow that, no matter how they tried." Carlton shook the man's hand warmly, remembering how crucial Carmichael's testimony in old records had been. "Thank you, Niles. I owe you a lot. Couldn't have done it alone." A short distance away, Justine lingered, phone in hand, typing something, likely a quick update to her volunteer group or a personal blog. She caught Carlton's eye and nodded once more, an unspoken message passing between them, "Your triumph matters." A small victory for dignity, not just for property lines. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, who knew if Thomason would plot some new angle, or if the man would accept defeat, Carlton felt a surge of empowerment. This was proof that a determined individual, armed with knowledge and tenacity, could challenge well-heeled opponents and cynicism from the bench. As he walked away from the courthouse, the air seemed sweeter, the weight on his shoulders replaced by a sense of clarity. Tucked under his arm, the battered briefcase no longer felt like a burden but like a trophy of perseverance. The future lay wide open. Maybe now, with the boundary dispute resolved, he could truly settle into Willow Creek, forging a fresh start that wasn't overshadowed by legal uncertainties. He might even find time to pick up studying law more formally, fulfilling the latent spark he once believed impossible. And in that quiet celebration, walking down the steps under a shining sky, he carried the knowledge that despite mockery, intimidation, and the suspicion of a jaded judge, truth, when pursued with unwavering resolve, could still bend the system toward what was right. Carlton Bascom woke the next day to a strange mixture of lingering relief and restless energy. Though the judge's ruling had definitively settled the boundary dispute in his favor, the sense of having emerged triumphant from such a tense courtroom clash made it difficult to simply resume normal life. He felt a simmering awareness, as if new doors might crack open for him now that he had demonstrated, before all eyes, a talent for legal reasoning and a resilience few expected. He spent the morning tidying up his small rented home. The act of reorganizing the stacks of papers and maps that had dominated his living room for weeks felt liberating, as though he was clearing away the fog of anxiety that had so often haunted his downtime. He carefully tucked the crucial exhibits into labeled folders, wondering if he might need them again should Thomason decide to mount an appeal. Yet, beneath the methodical calm, a tiny spark of excitement glowed. He couldn't deny that there was a part of him, long subdued by life's hardships, that now took quiet pride in his courtroom success. Later that afternoon, he ambled to the local cafe for a light lunch, finding it busier than usual. Heads turned as he approached the counter. A few folks he recognized from the courthouse offered discreet smiles or polite nods, acknowledging the man whose self-guided defense had turned a local land dispute into a subject of spirited talk. The barista, a young college student, gave him an encouraging grin and remarked, "Heard you gave quite a show in court the other day." Carlton responded with a humble shrug, placing an order for a coffee and a sandwich. Seating himself at a small table near a window, he sipped his drink while glancing at the local paper. Though the front page dealt with unrelated county matters, the next section contained a short article about his case, penned by a freelance writer who had witnessed the hearing. The headline read, "Underdog Triumphs in Fence Dispute, Bascom Outmaneuvers Prominent Landowner." Carlton's cheeks warmed reading that. The piece praised his diligent research and calm composure, hinting that the entire episode spoke to bigger themes of fairness and class disparities in Willow Creek's legal system. He folded the paper, quietly pondering how swiftly life could shift. Once, he had been a near-invisible newcomer, overshadowed by powerful neighbors. Now, while hardly a celebrity, he was recognized by strangers with nods of respect. A faint voice in his mind whispered that this might be the right moment to consider opportunities he had long shelved, like systematically studying law. Was it far-fetched to imagine himself as an actual attorney, serving the community's downtrodden and standing up to unscrupulous operators? The notion felt both exhilarating and intimidating. Still lost in thought, he nearly jumped when a presence loomed at his side. Looking up, he found Justine Maxwell smiling wryly, 2 cups of coffee balanced in one hand. "Saw you from across the room," she teased, nodding toward an empty chair. "Mind if I join?" Carlton gestured for her to sit. They exchanged friendly pleasantries before Justine produced a small envelope from her bag. "This came in through the Volunteer Resource Center," she explained. "It's addressed to you, though it was dropped off by a messenger who wasn't too forthcoming." Brows furrowing, Carlton opened it to discover a brief note on crisp stationery with no sender's name. "Mr. Bascom, I've witnessed your recent success and want to extend an offer to discuss future collaboration. Please meet me at the Willow Creek Inn Lounge this Friday evening, 7 p.m. You may find the proposal beneficial." No signature, no official letterhead, just an invitation. He and Justine exchanged quizzical looks. It wasn't unusual for someone to see potential in him after that high-profile defense, but secrecy around it felt suspicious. "Could be a business figure wanting to hire you for a property dispute," she mused. "Or an attorney who wants to groom you for paralegal work." Carlton tapped the note, uneasy. Or it could be a disguised approach from Thomason or his associates. "I'm not sure if it's an olive branch or a trap." They lapsed into a brief silence. The cafe's chatter swelled around them, but they both remained intent on the slip of paper. Eventually, Justine offered a perspective. "You could ignore it altogether, but that might mean missing a genuine opportunity. If you go, you should bring a friend. Or at least let someone know you're there." Nodding slowly, he tucked the note into his pocket. "That's sensible. I can't help feeling a bit paranoid, but after all that's happened, caution seems wise." He finished his lunch, and they drifted into easier topics: plans for the weekend, updates on a new community resource Justine was helping to organize for tenants in precarious housing situations. Occasionally, others approached to shake Carlton's hand or congratulate him, leading Justine to joke that he was becoming a local folk hero. The notion both amused and unsettled him. Over the next couple of days, the invitation nagged at him. He mulled whether to attend or discreetly avoid it. Part of him remained wary. What if it was a final intimidation tactic from people who resented his victory over Thomason? Another part of him argued that maybe, for once, the system's gatekeepers might see him as an asset, someone they couldn't easily dismiss. Friday arrived swiftly, and at 6:30 in the evening, he found himself smoothing down the collar of his shirt, tension knotting his stomach. He'd asked Justine to wait at the hotel lounge bar, ready to step in if something felt off. She'd readily agreed, seeing it as both a chance to ensure his safety and to quell her own curiosity. The Willow Creek Inn stood on a gentle rise, its facade decked in old-fashioned lamplights and creeping ivy. Inside, the lounge exuded a rustic elegance: warm wooden floors, plush seating, and low amber lighting. Carlton scanned the room. A handful of well-dressed patrons chatted near the fireplace, a few couples occupied intimate tables, and a lone musician in the corner coaxed mellow tunes from a piano. Unsure what to look for, he took a seat at the bar. Justine was already there, sipping a ginger ale inconspicuously. She gave him a tiny nod, signaling readiness. He'd barely settled when a slight figure in a tailored gray suit appeared behind him. "Mr. Bascom," came a quiet voice. Turning, he saw a middle-aged man with neatly combed salt and pepper hair. The stranger's face held a reserved smile, yet a certain analytical gleam danced in his eyes. "I see you received the note," he said, extending a hand. "Marcus Billingsley. May I buy you a drink?" Carlton introduced himself, declining the drink politely but ordering a club soda. "Your note was intriguing," he remarked. "Mind telling me who you represent?" A flicker of amusement crossed Billingsley's face. "Straight to the point, good. I'm with a regional law firm. We've kept an eye on the property fiasco involving you and Thomason. Actually, we've heard about how you presented your own case so convincingly. My partners and I suspect your talents could be put to valuable use." He motioned to a secluded table, and they relocated, leaving Justine within discreet sight. Marcus Billingsley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. "You're self-taught, yes? No formal law school background?" Carlton nodded, wariness entwined with curiosity. "That's right. I learned from reading anything I could get my hands on." A small, approving nod. "Quite a feat to best a seasoned attorney while representing yourself. The reason I reached out: our firm occasionally hires researchers and legal aides to handle the deeper complexities of property and civil disputes. We prefer individuals who have a keen mind, an eagerness to learn, but also an authentic understanding of how law impacts everyday people." Carlton's pulse quickened. Was this an actual job offer? It sounded like it. Still, he inquired carefully, "I appreciate the interest, but why keep it clandestine? A typed letter with no signature?" Billingsley shrugged, offering a slight, apologetic smile. "We maintain a certain discretion. Your case drew attention, and we suspect that if news spreads too soon that we're scouting you, certain local figures, like Thomason, might attempt to sabotage the arrangement. My firm wants to protect you from potential interference. We also wanted to gauge your interest before going public." A hush settled between them. Despite the man's polite tone, the mention of sabotage unnerved Carlton. Yet it matched the sense of caution swirling in Willow Creek since he'd challenged the local power structures. Hesitantly, he asked, "What exactly would this job entail?" "Initially, we'd take you on as a consultant or legal assistant, focusing on property disputes, boundary clarifications, local code interpretations, that kind of thing. You'd train under our attorneys, potentially working toward formal paralegal certification, or even law school down the line if that's your ambition. We see your potential, Mr. Bascom, and we believe your perspective could be a game changer, especially in bridging the gap between the legal system and people who can't afford typical counsel. Carlton braced himself, half expecting a catch. But Billingsley's expression was earnest. We do have certain conditions, of course. You'd need to relocate or at least be willing to commute, sign confidentiality agreements, and so forth. Compensation would be modest at first, but with real prospects for growth. Despite the swirl of questions and the uncertain scope of the offer, an undeniable thrill warmed Carlton's chest. This was precisely the sort of chance that had felt unreachable back when he'd juggled menial jobs and nursed a hidden fascination for the law. But caution reasserted itself. "Let me guess," he said with a wry half-smile. "You'll want me to handle tough, unglamorous cases?" Billingsley chuckled. "Perhaps. But unglamorous or not, your skill for thorough research and connecting with everyday clients is exactly what we admire. People are often intimidated by big firms. You, I suspect, could be a bridge, someone who knows how it feels to stand alone in court." A beat passed while Carlton processed the gravity of the conversation. He'd come expecting a possible trap or intimidation attempt, yet here was a door opening to something he'd secretly dreamed about, a real, structured path into the legal world, as improbable as it seemed. He carefully avoided an immediate answer, stating, "I appreciate the compliment. I'll need time to think it over." Billingsley nodded, slipping a crisp business card from his breast pocket. "Take your time. My contact info is here. If you decide this is worth exploring, set up a meeting and we'll go from there." They shared a parting handshake, the man's palm cool and confident. As Billingsley stepped away, Justine drifted over, eyebrows arched in curiosity. Carlton explained the unexpected proposition, voice still tinged with astonishment. She listened, sipping her ginger ale, eyes lighting up with excitement on his behalf. "You must realize, this might be a once-in-a-lifetime break," she said. "You've proved your mettle. Firms rarely recruit outsiders, let alone from a high-profile local spat." Carlton nodded. "I'm aware. But the idea of diving into that corporate environment, with all its complexities, it's thrilling and terrifying. I can't help questioning if I'm truly prepared." Justine placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Prepared or not, you've shown you can handle pressure. That's half the battle in law. And you wouldn't be alone. You'd have resources, mentors, a paycheck to support further studies." They left the Willow Creek Inn together, stepping into the mild evening air. Golden light from street lamps illuminated the walkway, and distant chatter from a nearby restaurant created a cozy hum. Despite the day's surreal developments, something about the night felt calm, as though the town itself exhaled after the tension of recent weeks. Carlton walked Justine to her car, heart thrumming with possibility. "I never thought a fence dispute would lead to this," he admitted. "I just wanted to keep what was mine. And now I might be able to do that for others, too." She laughed gently, cranking her engine. "Fate's funny that way, isn't it? Then, more seriously, whatever you decide, I'm glad you seized your chance to stand up for yourself. Not many people have the courage." Waving goodbye, he strolled home under the quiet hush of Willow Creek streets, the business card burning in his pocket like a symbol of uncharted horizons. He reflected on how drastically his life had pivoted in mere days, from dreading a forced eviction to entertaining the notion of forging a legal career. Even if he ended up declining Billingsley's proposal, he felt emboldened by the knowledge that he possessed a skill set once hidden by socioeconomic boundaries. Entering his dimly lit apartment, he flicked on the kitchen lamp and studied the card under its glow. His mind danced with questions. Could he truly assimilate into a professional law firm's environment? How might his newly minted local hero status affect their clients' perception? Would the bigger legal stage overshadow the personal satisfaction he found in solving practical, immediate disputes for people like him? He couldn't know those answers yet. But as he dropped the card on his small kitchen table and rummaged for a glass of water, a sense of resolve settled deep within him. At least now, he had a choice, a path that might unleash his unspoken passion for championing underdogs like himself. In the distance, a dog barked, and a car rumbled along the quiet street. Carlton set the glass down with a clink and exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, he might call Billingsley to discuss the details. Or perhaps he'd let it simmer a bit longer. Either way, he recognized in that moment that the flame of possibility had been lit. The law, once a distant fascination, now beckoned him forward with a promise he could no longer ignore. Carlton Bascom woke earlier than usual the next day, mind buzzing with the possibilities that had emerged from his surprise encounter at the Willow Creek Inn. He spent the morning pacing around his small living room, pausing now and then to pick up and put down the business card Marcus Billingsley had handed him. There was a phone number and an email, nothing else. The minimalism felt intentional, like the man and his offer were testing Carlton's willingness to step into a place where connections were forged quietly, away from the public eye. He hadn't decided whether to call yet, torn between the excitement of a new horizon and a lingering wariness. By mid-afternoon, the indecision gnawed at him enough that he needed a change of scenery. He set out for the community library, a cozy building he'd come to know intimately during his feverish preparation for the Thomason case. Its old wooden shelves and the subdued hush of turning pages offered him solace. Perhaps immersing himself in the environment that had taught him so much about law, and about himself, would provide clarity. The librarian, an elderly woman with a kind smile, waved in recognition as he took a seat at a small table near the back. Once settled, he opened a thick volume on civil procedure, the very one he'd pored over numerous times, hoping the familiar text might ground him. The lines of statutes and commentary felt almost comforting. He flipped absently, though, not reading with the same fervor as before. The outcome of his case had changed the dynamic. No longer was he an anxious defendant, scrambling to stave off disaster. He was a free man entertaining the notion that law could be more than a shield, it could be a vocation. He had glimpsed, during that courtroom struggle, the power and responsibility of knowledge and how swiftly it could tip the scales of justice. A soft scrape of a chair at his table made him glance up. Justine Maxwell slid into the seat across from him, resting her forearms on the tabletop. She wore a casual sweater and had her hair pulled back, giving her a relaxed but purposeful demeanor. "I thought I might find you here," she whispered, mindful of the library's hush. He closed the book and offered a small laugh. "Didn't realize I was so predictable." She shrugged. "After all the research you did to win your case, I figured you might come back here to think." Leaning in, she tilted her head. "So, any progress on that cryptic job offer from Billingsley?" Carlton groaned softly and shook his head. "I'm still torn. One part of me sees it as a rare second chance. Maybe I can find real mentorship and build a career out of something I stumbled into out of necessity. Another part of me wonders if I can trust this approach. Why such secrecy? And do I really want to be part of a big law firm that might handle shady clients?" Her gaze flicked down to the business card he'd unconsciously been spinning between his fingers. "You won your case, but I get that you're still uneasy. It's natural. This is a big leap." She paused. "Have you considered meeting with him again, but on your terms? Insist on more transparency before you commit." "I have," Carlton admitted, idly toying with the corner of the card's glossy surface. "I'm not going to just sign on blindly. I'd need details, like their ethical standards, which cases they typically take, what role they envision for me." His expression shifted, turning pensive. "I don't want to be a pawn in some corporate game that profits off people like me." Justine nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. Not all large firms are heartless. Some genuinely do pro bono work or serve underrepresented communities. Marcus might be sincere in wanting someone with your unique perspective. But you should demand clarity." He set the card aside, gaze drifting over the library's high shelves. I also keep thinking about going to law school, but I have no illusions about the cost and the competitive environment. And I'm not exactly fresh out of high school. If Billingsley's firm could sponsor me or allow me to earn while I learn, that might be the only feasible route. An undercurrent of excitement laced his words. Justine smiled. Sounds like you're leaning toward exploring the offer. That's good. At the very least, you'll know if it's the right fit. If not, you'll find another way. You've come this far. Before Carlton could respond, the librarian ambled over, a slightly apologetic look on her face. Sorry, but we need to keep the volume down, she whispered with a wink. Also, Mr. Carmichael is here looking for you. They both turned to see Niles Carmichael, the retired surveyor who had testified on Carlton's behalf. He stood at the reference desk, cane in hand, scanning the library. Carlton waved, and Niles meandered over, footsteps echoing faintly on the polished floor. He greeted them in hushed tones. Didn't expect to see you two here, but I'm glad I did. Niles perched carefully on a nearby chair. I've been thinking about your case, Carlton. You know I was impressed by how well you handled yourself in front of the judge. He glanced around conspiratorially, as if the library's dusty tomes were eavesdropping. I've had folks in the community approach me, asking if I think you might help them with boundary disputes, property claims, minor code issues. They saw your performance and figure you're practically a lawyer. Carlton's brows rose in surprise. I'm not licensed, though. It's risky to represent others without the credentials. Niles waved off the objection. They're not talking about formal court representation. More like, can you help them gather evidence, interpret records, write affidavits? That kind of stuff. A consulting role, maybe. They can't afford real attorneys. Just want guidance so they don't get bulldozed in small claims or landlord-tenant spats. He shot Justine a look, and she nodded. I've heard similar murmurs, she said softly. Since your victory, folks see you as an ally, someone who overcame the odds. They wonder if you might stand up for them too. Carlton felt a pang in his chest. He recalled how alone he had felt facing Thomason's lawsuit. If not for his personal determination and a bit of luck, he could have lost everything. Now, the prospect of helping others navigate the labyrinth of local laws resonated deeply with him. I'd like to, he admitted. But I have to be careful. Practicing law without a license is a crime. I'm not trying to get into trouble. Niles placed a reassuring hand on his cane. You can't call yourself a lawyer, but you can share your knowledge. Sometimes that's enough to tip the balance for regular folks. My guess is, if you joined that firm Billingsley spoke about, your ability to help people on a bigger scale might grow even more. The mention of Billingsley circled back, intensifying the choice swirling in Carlton's mind. On the one hand, an immediate, grassroots approach, informally advising neighbors, bridging the knowledge gap that nearly crushed him. On the other, a more formal path with real resources, actual training, and the potential for a law degree. Each path had benefits and risks, moral complexities, and uncertain outcomes. He closed his eyes briefly, the library's muted hum enveloping him. It's a lot to process, he finally said, voice subdued. I want to do right by people in Willow Creek, but also secure a stable future for myself. If I can help more systematically by going legit, maybe that's the route. But if the firm's just another machine, he trailed off, recalling corporate horror stories where big firms took money from wealthy clients to evict tenants. Was Billingsley's group any different? Justine gave him a sympathetic look. You'll figure it out. It's not a decision that has to be made overnight. But you have support, whichever way you lean. People here trust you because they saw you fight your own battle with honesty. Niles nodded. That's right. And you can always keep one foot in the community, advocating pro bono through local nonprofits. A firm might even encourage it, some do a decent chunk of pro bono work for PR or altruistic reasons. The idea gave him a flicker of hope, bridging the formal legal world with local activism. Perhaps that was the sweet spot he craved. "I'll talk to Billingsley again," he decided aloud, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Set up a direct meeting. Lay out my conditions, ask about their values and cases. If they're legit, I'll consider it. If not, I'll find another path." Seeing his resolve, Niles grinned, eyebrows lifting. "Good plan, son. And if you need help from an old surveyor for the rest of your days, I'm around," he joked. They shared a quiet laugh, mindful of the library's gentle hush. For a moment, the dusty sunlight drifting through tall windows seemed to hold them in a calm bubble, a respite from the swirling complexities of life. Yet beyond that tranquil scene, decisions awaited, ones that could set Carlton's future on a brand new course. Before departing, they swapped contact info. Justine insisted on being present if he met with Billingsley again, offering moral support and a second pair of eyes to catch any hidden agendas. Carlton agreed gratefully, feeling more confident with friends in his corner. As he left the library, stepping into the bright afternoon glare, he paused on the threshold, letting the mild breeze brush across his face. The transformation from an anxious defendant in a small-town dispute to a prospective paralegal or legal researcher felt surreal. But in its own way, the path had been laid out by the quiet nights he'd spent memorizing statutes, by the unwavering moral compass that had guided him through the trial. Life's twists, he reflected, were sometimes the impetus for extraordinary reinvention. He walked home at a leisurely pace, mind abuzz with potential next steps. The contact card from Billingsley weighed in his pocket, a silent reminder of the fork in the road he now faced. Yet the sense of burden that had once accompanied the unknown no longer felt as daunting. Instead, a new sense of possibility glimmered. If fate was offering him a platform to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for many others, then perhaps the best way to honor the victory he'd earned was to embrace that invitation, forging ahead with open eyes and a steadfast heart. On a bright Monday morning a week later, Carlton Bascom found himself outside the offices of Billingsley and Harris, a discreet yet impressive brick building situated near Willow Creek's revived downtown district. His heart thumped with a nervous energy that was becoming familiar, similar to how he'd felt stepping into the courthouse, except this time the stakes were altogether different. As he climbed the stone steps, he noticed the firm's brass nameplate gleaming in the sun, a sign that he stood on the threshold of a life-altering possibility. He'd requested this meeting after a careful weekend of consideration, drafting a short list of questions and concerns on a notepad he now carried under his arm. Outside the front entrance, he paused. Though he'd worn the best clothes he had and smoothed his hair more carefully than usual, the anxious thought crept in, would he be out of his depth in these polished corridors of power? But recalling Justine's advice, and the memory of how he'd faced down a condescending judge, he took a breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the reception area felt spacious and quietly opulent. Soft classical music played overhead, and tasteful modern art dotted the walls. A receptionist, dressed in business casual attire, greeted him with a polite smile. "Mr. Bascom. Mr. Billingsley is waiting for you. Right this way, please." She led him down a hallway lined with glass-walled offices, some occupied by sharp-eyed associates tapping away on laptops or conferring with clients. It was a world, Carlton realized, that rarely intersected with the everyday struggles of folks who lived paycheck to paycheck. Yet something inside him lit up with curiosity. If he could bridge that gap, bringing the clarity and empathy he'd cultivated, perhaps he could help more people than he ever could on his own. Finally, the receptionist ushered him into a bright corner office. Marcus Billingsley rose from behind a large desk, his expression warm and eager. "Carlton," he said, extending a hand. "I'm glad you decided to come." The older man motioned him to a comfortable chair opposite the desk, where a folder labeled Bascom sat neatly. On a side table, 2 cups of tea steamed gently, their fragrant aroma wafting into the room. Carlton settled, determined to remain poised. He recalled his vow to handle this conversation on his own terms. "I won't take up more time than necessary," Billingsley began, easing back into his seat. "We're thrilled by your willingness to consider joining us. After your performance in the Thomason case, we believe you possess a rare combination of practical knowledge, determination, and the ability to connect with people who often distrust the legal system." Carlton inclined his head politely, flipping open the small notepad resting on his knee. "I'm flattered by the offer. But before I commit, I have questions," he said, voice steady. "I'd like to know about your firm's typical clients, your stance on pro bono work, and how exactly you'd see me fitting in, given that I'm not formally trained or certified." Billingsley nodded, seeming pleased that Carlton cut straight to the point. "Of course. We handle a range of civil matters, property disputes, contract negotiations, small business issues. While we do represent well-off clients, we also maintain a pro bono wing. The firm's leadership is keen on balancing commercial success with community engagement. It's one of the reasons I joined them years ago." He paused meaningfully. "We see you as a potential asset for that pro bono segment, especially for lower-income, unrepresented individuals who might trust someone with your background more than a typical corporate attorney. And as for training, we'd sponsor you for a paralegal certificate. Down the road, if you choose law school, we'd consider supporting that as well." The answer aligned surprisingly well with what Carlton had hoped to hear. But he pressed on. "Would there be any conflict if a wealthy client demanded we handle a case that tramples on the rights of people like me?" A flicker of uncertainty brushed Billingsley's features, but he didn't flinch. "In large firms, conflicts do arise. We manage them carefully. Sometimes we have to recuse ourselves if representing one side would harm existing pro bono clients. I can't promise you a perfect moral record, no law firm can. But I can promise you that our leadership is conscious of such dilemmas and tries to act ethically." Carlton studied the man's face, searching for sincerity. He saw no trace of the overblown bravado or cunning deflection that typically marked lawyers catering to unscrupulous agendas. Billingsley, though certainly polished, seemed genuine enough. "I'd need to be involved in deciding which cases I work on, at least to some degree," Carlton ventured. "You'll have that," Billingsley agreed, "within reason. We do expect employees to be team players, but we're not looking to exploit you for questionable deals. We want your voice, your unique perspective, to guide our community outreach. After all, you've proven that you understand how to interpret documents and argue effectively on behalf of the underdog." A mild heat rose to Carlton's cheeks at the praise. The memory of standing in front of Judge Whitcomb, methodically presenting evidence in that quiet but unyielding manner, surfaced. Perhaps that was indeed the skill set Billingsley valued. They spent another half-hour delving into specifics: a modest but stable starting salary, the structure of the firm's junior associate track, even though he wasn't a lawyer, and the courses he'd need to become a paralegal. The timeline for possibly entering law school if he wished. The hours might be long, Billingsley warned, but the firm was open to him shaping a schedule that included occasional volunteer nights at the local resource center. Carlton pressed him on intangible details. Would he be free to advocate for tenants or stand up for homeowners wronged by powerful developers? Billingsley seemed more than willing to let him do so, framing it as beneficial for the firm's public image and moral standing. The man's candor comforted him further, dissolving some cynicism about big law. Eventually, Billingsley slid a typed letter across the desk. "This is our preliminary offer. Nothing binding yet, read it carefully, ask questions, and we can revise. But I hope it conveys our commitment to nurturing your talent." Carlton scanned the lines, heart thrumming with excitement. The terms looked fair, especially for someone with no formal credentials. He traced a finger along the paragraph promising partial tuition assistance if he pursued law school after a year's service. In the hush of that moment, he glimpsed a future not just as a brash newcomer who overcame a single court case, but as a legitimate player in a system that he believed needed more voices from modest backgrounds. When he looked up, Billingsley's expression was one of quiet expectancy. "I'd like to accept," Carlton said, voice catching slightly. "But I need a few days to finalize personal details. And I still want to run it by a friend, Justine. You might have met her." Billingsley beamed, nodding. "By all means, take the time. I'm delighted you're leaning that way." They shook hands, a brief but firm gesture sealing the potential partnership. Outside the office, the late morning air felt crisp against Carlton's face. He found Justine waiting in the inn's lounge across the street, where she'd stationed herself in case he needed a quick exit. Upon seeing his subdued but bright smile, she raised her eyebrows questioningly. "I think I'm doing it," he said, not quite believing the words himself. "They were straightforward, answered my concerns. It might actually be a place where I can do some good and learn the ropes properly." Justine let out a small cheer under her breath. "That's wonderful, Carlton. You deserve this break. Seriously." She sipped her coffee with a grin. "Never imagined that fence fight would lead you to a law firm gig, huh?" He let out a low, incredulous laugh. "Never in a million years. But it's happening. Life's weird like that." For the next hour, they discussed the path forward. Perhaps he would keep living in Willow Creek, commuting to the firm's main office a few towns over. The daily travel might be taxing, but the trade-off seemed worth it. Justine recommended a paralegal prep course run by a local community college to get him started, and he scribbled the details onto a notepad. They also contemplated how the local neighbors, those who'd come to him for informal advice, might benefit from his new connections. Their conversation meandered into talk of broader injustices plaguing rural communities, from shady land grabs to questionable eviction notices. Each new anecdote sharpened Carlton's conviction that his skill for unraveling complex legal webs could help the people typically excluded from high-powered law. Instead of limiting himself to occasional guidance, now he had a chance to channel that knowledge into tangible, long-term solutions. When they finally parted ways, Justine teased him about needing a better wardrobe to fit into a professional setting, and he chuckled sheepishly. "Guess I'll be doing some thrift store runs," he said, only half joking. The feeling of belonging on the cusp of something meaningful blossomed inside him. That evening, back in his small living room, he studied the typed letter Billingsley had given him, carefully noting each clause. He circled or underlined areas he wanted clarified. Then, summoning the same diligence he'd applied to the Thomason dispute, he wrote a short list of follow-up questions to email the firm. "Never sign anything without reading the fine print," he murmured to himself, recalling the caution hammered into him by the hours spent devouring legal texts. After clicking send on the email, he leaned back, letting out a long breath. So much had happened in the past month, from mounting dread that he'd lose his home, to winning a court case, to possibly reinventing his entire career path. The transition felt almost cinematic. Yet a new calm settled over him, knowing that no matter where this led, he was forging a direction guided by both practical necessity and a deep moral drive to help others. He stepped outside, the twilight sky glowing in streaks of purple and orange over Willow Creek's rooftops. Cars ambled along the quiet street, and the hum of cicadas added a gentle symphony to the early evening air. Standing on the porch, the boards creaking faintly beneath his feet, he allowed himself to imagine the future. He pictured stepping into a new role at Billingsley's firm, maybe drafting memoranda, assisting attorneys in depositions, taking calls from distressed tenants or small business owners. He saw himself continuing to hone the arguments he once used for self-defense, but now for clients who, like him, might otherwise face powerful interests alone. The image brought a smile. Even if it took years to earn a law license, if that was indeed the path he chose, he could begin bridging the gap right away. The synergy of formal training and personal empathy felt like the best route to ensuring justice wasn't a resource hoarded by the privileged few. If a single fence dispute had taught him anything, it was that knowledge plus determination could undermine even the most entrenched biases. He'd no doubt face challenges, some from the firm's internal politics, some from unscrupulous clients, and some from the complexities of balancing corporate demands with genuine community aid. But each step forward, however small, would serve to redeem the promise he'd glimpsed in that small claims courtroom, that one determined voice could, at times, resonate as loudly as the entrenched power behind it. The night breeze carried a subtle hint of approaching autumn, rustling the leaves of a nearby oak. Carlton closed his eyes and let that gentle wind wash over him. He was no longer the anxious, overshadowed man who had walked into a courtroom overshadowed by Judge Whitcomb's disapproval. He was someone who had proven that adversity could become a launchpad, that improbability could birth possibility. With the faint ring of his phone chiming inside, perhaps an email response from Billingsley, he headed back indoors, buoyed by a sense of purpose as fresh as the night air. Tomorrow, or perhaps the next day, he would finalize the details of his new position. He would stride into that polished law office not as an outsider to be brushed aside, but as a rising figure determined to ensure that, in Willow Creek and beyond, the law could truly be for everyone. Though the path ahead was uncertain, the prospect of forging a better, brighter future lent him the quiet optimism he needed. And as he settled into an evening spent drafting prospective case outlines, reading more property law compendiums, and scribbling a personal mission statement in the margins of an old notepad, Carlton Bascom dared to envision the day he might stand tall in any courtroom, no trace of doubt or condescension overshadowing the silent promise he carried, to uphold truth, champion the underdog, and bend the system ever closer to real justice.